Similar to data sources, vector tools are used to work with multiple values at once. Most of the vector tools in the editor are made to work together, so we may be jumping around a bit in the menus, but for now, let's start at the beginning by going to Tools, Triggers and Events, Data Sources, and Spawn a Vector. By default, vectors are set up to handle 3 numbers, labeled x, y, and z. This is handy because you can use these for the x, y, and z coordinates of objects. But vectors are not limited to 3 numbers. They can handle from 2 to 1,000 values. The vector size field is where you set the amount of values the vectors can hold. You notice, if you go above 4 values, you cannot manually adjust the values separately. You can only set the base values of every value in the vector by setting a value in Fill with Value. To adjust the values of a vector individually, you need a setVector event. SetVector is located in Events. It's basically the same as a setValue event, only it's used to set the values in a vector. In Properties, let's go to Type first. We see the same value adjustments we see in setValue events. These determine how the event will adjust the values already in the vector. Next is 3-size vector. With this checked, you have the 3 x, y, and z values you could set all at once. Select a vector with the Select Event Target option, and it will set the x, y, and z values in that vector to what you set here. Remember, this event needs an impulse to work. With 3-size vector unchecked, you can only adjust one value at a time. You see, the options change from x, y, and z to index and value. Index is the position in the vector of the value you want to change. For instance, say a vector is set up to hold 6 values. Each value in the vector holds a position or place in the vector called the index. The first position in the index is 0, the second is index 1, the third is index 2, and so on. Now back in setVector, value is the number it will use to adjust the value in the target index position. Another vector tool we need to cover in Events is CopyVector. This tool is used to copy all or some of the vector's values to a new vector. Let's have a look at the properties. Starting with source index, this is the index number of the first value you want to start copying from the source vector. Next, we have the amount of values to copy. This determines how many values you want to start copying from the source index. Target index is the index value you want to start pasting values into the target vector or vectors. Select Source Vector is where you select the vector to use as the source for your values. Select Target Vectors is where you select the vector or vectors to copy the values into. Now let's go back to Data Sources and look at the Get Vector Data Source. This tool is fairly simple. It's used to get one number from a vector data source. In the properties, we have the 2 settings we need. Select Vector is where you select the vector you want to extract the value from. Select Index is where you set the value you want to extract. You see, it gets the values from the vector immediately. This tool does not need an impulse to make it work. Now let's look at one of my favorite tools, the Vector Object Info. Basically, the same as Object Info Data Source, except it holds all 3 axes values instead of 1. In Properties, the Type setting is where you set the information you want to get from an object. This has less settings than the Object Info Data Source because this tool only uses options that use the X, Y, and Z axes. This tool would be invaluable to you if you're going to be animating objects, which we'll get deeper into in the Object Position Event tutorial later in the series. Next, let's look at the Curve Vector Data Source. It's like the Curve Data Source, but it creates curves for multiple values at once. In the properties, you see the only difference is start and end values. Here, we need to use a vector data source as the values instead of a single value data source. You'll see in the Object Position Event tutorial, this is really nice for making animations easier. A couple of other vector tools we need to talk about are operators. First, the scalar operator. This tool basically produces one number from a set of numbers in a vector. Let's check out the properties. First is type. This allows you to select 1 or 2 vector data sources to get the resulting value. Next is operation. This determines how the value is calculated. Length uses an equation to calculate the length of the vector. This is fairly complex math, which we don't have time for, so we'll put a link in the description below for more information. Size is simply the number of index positions the vector holds. Min pulls the smallest value from the vector's values, and of course max takes the largest value. Mean is the average of all the values in the vector, and finally, sum is the sum of all the values in the vector added together. Vector operand is how you choose the vectors you are getting the values from, and depending on type, you either have 1 or 2 vectors to choose. With input type set to 2 vectors, the operations change. Dot product is fairly complex math. We will put a link in the descriptions for more information. Equals and not equals are true and false values. This tool will equal 1 if the condition between the two vectors is true and 0 if the condition is false. Our next vector tool is the vector operator. This tool has some fairly advanced math options, and unfortunately, once again, we don't have time to talk about them all. But I'll try to cover most of what you need in this tool. The purpose of this tool is to use 2 or more vectors to create a new vector. Now let's check out the properties. Our first choice is input type. This determines how many vectors you are working with and how you are working with them. By default, it's set to 2 vectors. With n vectors, you can use as many vectors as you want. Vector and value will use a single value to adjust the values in the vector. And finally, vector will adjust the values of a single vector. As you've already probably noticed, the operation options change depending on the type. Operation is where you set how the new vector values will be calculated from the various input types. Once again, we don't have time to go over everything here. It will take too long. Some of these are really complex mathematical equations. I would suggest online resources for further information on these options. Most types give you vector operands. This is where you select the vectors you want to get the calculations from by selecting vector data sources as your target objects. Vector and value alternately gives you an option to set a value, which you can set manually or pick a data source value object.